So what I want to do next is go through like a quick history of the last 30, 40 years, particularly looking at what happened to government and how government got targeted, both in order to explain why what happened, and in order to give us the foundation for a story that we can tell to push back this dominant story that we're hearing. So here it goes. If you go back to when I was a kid in the 1950s, 1960s, we had a manufacturing-based economy. Manufacturing was the most profitable part of the economy by far. Blue chip companies like General Motors, General Electric made double-digit profits just about every year. That's where you put your money if you were an investor. It was the best return you could get and the safest return. Because unions were strong, they were able to extract better and better wages and benefits from these companies every year. So money flowed out of these companies into workers and their families. For the first time in their lives, workers were able to buy homes, buy a car, send a kid to college, send all the kids to college, maybe buy a second home or a boat. It was the building of the so-called blue-collar middle class. Workers' incomes doubled over a period of 32 years, from 1947 to 1979. Tremendous wealth got built up in the working class because these industries were extremely productive and profitable, because they didn't have a lot of competition anywhere in the world, and because unions were strong and were able to compel them to cough up a consistent share of productivity. Productivity rose and wages rose with productivity. Money also flowed out of these into the public sector. Roads, infrastructure, education, all of the infrastructure that's crumbling now got built up then because taxes were very high. Anyone know how high the top marginal tax rate was in the 1950s? 94. You're well informed. So what this means is that if you made over $400,000 a year back in the 1950s, you paid 90 cents out of every dollar to the federal government in income taxes over that amount.
Nobody paid that.
Well,
they had lots of loopholes.
No, that wasn't the effective tax rate, but it was the rate on the books. I mean, no one paid that amount on the total of their income. But I mean, I remember a story growing up, again, of a reporter going to visit a CEO of a company who was living on Long Island. I grew up in Connecticut, so I read the New York Times. The reporter drives up to this guy's house and finds, it's a weekend, finds him fixing his own gutters. The guy was paying a 90% marginal tax rate. He said, I'm not going to pay 10 times the cost of fixing these gutters. I'm going to do it myself. Could you imagine a CEO now fixing his own gutters? This is the kind of compression of society that's happened.
And what created jobs by lowering the tax rate, though.
That's one argument. But because of high corporate, so for corporations in the 1940s paid 40% of the whole federal budget. Now it's down to about 10%. So there's been, back then, taxes were high enough on the top income earners and on corporations that money got plowed into infrastructure, which basically we own in common. So society built up a lot of wealth as well as individual working people then.
Also in the 50s, the corporate share of the federal budget and the individual income tax share of the federal budget was roughly the same. And whereas today, the individual share is about 40%, and the corporate share is, like I said, I think it's 8 or 9%.
Yeah, the corporate share is way down.
And the Democrats
gotta keep your voice up.
Yep.
The Democrats organized that beginning in the late 50s and carried through that policy all the way through the 90s.
Great. So the third place that money went was back into these companies, especially with high corporate tax rates. So they plowed money back into new plant, new machinery, expansion. With the dominant economy was called retain and reinvest. They didn't pull out the money, they didn't strip these companies, they put it back in. So a lot of money, shareholders' money, investors' money, wasn't paid out in dividends, it got plowed back in. So, the result of all of this was that workers bought stuff from these companies, the public sector bought stuff from these companies, they were reinvesting in themselves. So the economy steadily expanded, but wealth got spread throughout the economy, and it worked for everybody. Even though taxes were high, great fortunes were accumulated during this time, until about 1966, when the system hit a brick wall. If you look at a chart of corporate profits overall, manufacturing profits, not financial profits, you see, zigs and zags, but generally the rate is pretty high, and it's increasing up to about 11% around 1966, and suddenly it takes a nosedive, and it never recovers. It's never been as high as it was then, and it stays down for a couple of decades.
I just want to point out, when Mike says it worked for everybody, in the 50s, we know that there were a lot of people who were still excluded from this prosperity that was more broadly shared than it is today. People of color, women did not get the same kind of advantages that a lot of white men did at this time.
Thank you. And what happened was movements for economic justice and civil justice. So the so-called civil rights movement, the women's movement, basically extended the same economic benefits and rights to everybody in the population for a very brief period of time.
Say Johnson never would have had the Great Society movement if it worked for everybody. So a lot of
Right.
money went to Appalachia and places like that as well. So.
Right. So something happened that knocked this system off kilter, and what it was foreign manufacturing. The United States ended World War II with half of the factories in the entire world, half of the industrial capacity. And there was, GM could make a car, sell it anywhere in the world, for any price it wanted. There effectively was very little competition, and definitely in this country, there wasn't a lot of competition. So if workers got a better deal out of GM every year in their union contract, GM could just turn around and raise the price on that car and get it back. So, it just rolled along until suddenly, if people remember who were back, around back then, 66 is about when you start seeing Volkswagens, Japanese consumer electronics, because Japan had rebuilt, Europe had rebuilt, now they have newer factories, more efficient plant, lower paid workers, and they can undercut the price of US-made goods. And suddenly, these CEOs are facing vicious price competition that cuts into their profits. If you were a CEO, what are all the ways you could reduce your costs? This is what they had to reduce their costs or go out of business. How are all the ways you can reduce your costs? Pay the workers less?
Increase the intensity of labor.
So speed up, basically.
Longer hours.
Longer hours.
Export jobs overseas.
Go where the labor's cheaper.
Lay people off.
Lay people off.
Get your taxes cut.
Cut your taxes, reduce benefits.
Raise prices on the goods you create.
Yep. Yep. So you would make good CEOs. They did all these things. And that's pretty much the history of the last 30 years, is consistent corporate strategies being done to do all those things. Busting unions so that you can cut down wages and cut benefits and so forth.